All right, let's go back to this now. A meeting of African trade ministers in the Democratic Republic of Congo has agreed to fast-track policies that will promote trade on the continent in order to reduce their reliance on foreign markets. The move comes a few weeks after the United States imposed a 10% tariff on imports from African countries. For more on this now, we speak to the Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area, Wamkele Mene. Good evening to you, Mr. Mene, and thank you so much for your time. Now, this is a meeting, of course, that's taking place during heightened global tensions. Let's just start with some of the key outcomes.
Thank you for having us. Well, the ministers took account of the state of the multilateral trading system in general, in particular, the measures by the United States as they impact on African countries and specifically countries that trade with the US under AGOA. Clearly, there is a materially adverse impact on many African countries as a result of these tariffs, and the ministers agreed to recommend to the heads of states to take specific steps in order to safeguard the continent of Africa from these measures.
It's one thing to, of course, have the ministers, right, agree and talk about what needs to be done. But are you getting a sense that the continent is speaking in one voice here?
That's precisely one of the priority areas of agreement, that as a continent we should speak with not just with one voice, but in a coordinated manner to ensure that we safeguard the continent and the AFCFTA from these unilateral measures that the United States has taken. All of us are affected, even countries whose exports under AGOA are relatively minimal, they are also affected. Countries that are not in AGOA are also affected. So, for example, countries in North Africa, Morocco, Egypt, Tunisia, etc. Everybody's affected on the continent. And so it's very important that we take a coordinated approach, not just in response to the US and its unilateral measures, but also in defense of economic integration on the continent of Africa. So these are the two reasons why there has to be a coordinated approach.
And there were calls from the APRM during their retreat in South Africa last week that there must be an emergency meeting of heads of state and government to look at the issues, because they say that it's one thing to have the Council of Ministers coming together to speak, but the heads of states are the ones that make the final decisions. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. The position of APRM is correct. The final decision rests with the Assembly of Heads of States and Government of the African Union. That is the final authority on these matters. Of course, the Assembly of Heads of States and Government takes advice and recommendations from the Ministers of Trade. As you know, the Ministers of Trade are appointed by the Heads of States. And so we will approach our heads of states with a very clear set of recommendations, a very clear roadmap, a strategic approach as to how we believe our continent should respond to these measures, not just, as I said earlier, not just for the purpose of a response in and of itself, but also a long-term strategy as to how the continent can safeguard herself from in the immediate and long-term long-term future against the US measures of protectionism.
And you do have some who are watching the developments around the tariffs, and they say that it's time now for Africa to really just be a bit more inward looking and to ensure that it does everything it can to either cushion itself, especially when you think about the fact that we've borne as a continent a disproportionate burden as far as the COVID-19 pandemic is concerned. You think about climate change and all of that. So now you have those who are saying that it is time for us to be a bit more inward looking. What lessons would you say, as the AFCFTA, you've learned as far as intra-trade is concerned and its importance?
Well, what we can observe is that the continent of Africa is not should not be reliant on others in terms of export markets. We have a market of 1.4 billion people with a combined GDP of 3.4 trillion United States dollars as we speak. The size in terms of population of the African market is comparable to India and China. And therefore, there is a capability that we have and an endowment to build domestic markets that will ensure the economic self-sufficiency of our continent without necessarily disengaging from the global economy. So the very, very important and critical step is that our continent must immediately eliminate intra-Africa barriers to trade, whether it's agricultural products, processing of critical minerals. This is where our continent has an advantage, and that is a domestic market, which is viable in our view. However, it will take that we accelerate implementation of the already taken steps aimed at boosting intra-Africa trade.
When you look at the continent, I know you've touched on it just a little bit, but would you say that the issue of infrastructure has also been addressed over time, or is it still something that's lagging behind?
The African Development Bank estimates the infrastructure deficit in Africa to be over $130 billion annually. That's a significant amount. There have been very, very positive steps that have been taken to address that infrastructure deficit. The AFDB itself, over the last 5 years, has invested close to $45 billion in infrastructure. Afrexim Bank has invested over $20 billion in infrastructure over the last 15 to 20 years. Obviously, this is nowhere near enough to address that infrastructure deficit. And we've got to address the infrastructure deficit because that's how we will be able to introduce interventions, measures, and have infrastructure that supports trade, enhanced, accelerated trade in Africa. I believe we're going in the right direction. Of course, it's nowhere near enough, the measures, the interventions that have been made and the investments that have been made. I believe that there is a role for the private sector to play, whether we are talking about private equity, whether we are talking about sovereign wealth funds. There is a role to play for the private sector to invest in Africa's infrastructure, along with our development finance institutions who, as you know, take the lion's share of risk mitigation in terms of investing in infrastructure on our continent.
It's quite interesting and even possibly heartwarming to learn that the needle has moved, as much as there's still a lot more that needs to be done. But it seems, as you say, some of the work has begun there and continues in that area. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it this evening. That was Wamkele Mene, the Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area.